I did a little thing for the St. Lawrence in Utica does a couple times a year with their catechetical program. The kids, they come and pray, they eat dinner, the kids go off to the classrooms, the parents come in one place and there's some kind of a conversation that's helpful. And so I was doing the social teaching of the church. And I was recommending a book called Living Justice by Massaro, a Jesuit at Boston College. And it's very readable. Sometimes these church documents are really, they're theology books, and they sometimes you fall asleep in 15 minutes trying to read them. So Massaro does a nice job of showing where the social teachings of the church can be found, and he kind of summarizes 10 themes of social justice. So I took those 10 themes, and it wasn't very hard to find little quotations from Pope Francis for each of those 10 themes. And they fit on two sides of a piece of paper. I didn't bring them with me today, but I'll send them to you by email, and you can maybe post them on the website or something. Because it's kind of a nice little summary, 10 different things that comprise Catholic social teaching. Actually, there's more than 10, but these are the 10 main ones. And Massaro's book is worth reading. It's easy to read. Well, it's not like reading a novel, I guess, but it's readable, and it kind of helps you understand. Oh, yeah, that's what they're talking about. Okay, mercy. The Pope has declared there's going to be a holy year of mercy. So this is the program, as he says. And we have been talking about the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And in traditional teaching, Catholic teaching, there are 7 corporal works of mercy. There are 7 spiritual works of mercy. I guess there's something about the 7 days of the week that kind of inspires it. 7 sacraments, 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, 7 capital sins, everything comes in 7. So we meant to pass out this flyer as a explanation, but I think I forgot to do that the first week. So you got it now. And the corporal works of mercy are pretty easy to find. They're in Matthew 25. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was in prison and you set me free. So those are relatively easy to find. The spiritual works of mercy are just kind of sprinkled throughout. And so this is a nice summary from McBrien's Encyclopedia of Catholicism. So just so that you can know from where in the Bible you find references to mercy. Last week I was going to pass these questions that the Pope has called the Synod on the Family. And so when we're talking about the church being an agent of God's mercy, the Pope is aware that sometimes the church's teachings do not seem to facilitate mercy. Sometimes they seem to be more restrictions than mercy. So he's asking the bishops of the world to think about how can we be more a sign of mercy when we're dealing with issues of family life. And so there are 46 questions they've come up with, and with some fairly profound theology to go with them, but their questions are pretty much about how could the church respond better in preparing couples for marriage, in dealing with situations that are complicated in marriage, that kind of thing. How could we be more merciful? So this is a 3-page thing, and if you're going to respond to this, it has to be done right now because they're collecting this data right now. So you can just, if you're interested in doing that, there are ways that you can communicate your responses to the Pope, either through the diocese or write to him directly. He'll probably answer your phone call. Let me summarize what we're doing. We started off talking heart to heart, person to person, with our heart in the heart of God. That was the first week. Last week we talked about the church being the heart of mercy. And this week, we're going to be talking about how we can bring the heart of God into the heart of the world. So how do we reach out to the world in a heartfelt way? So there's going to be 3 points. And these are themes that are from Casper's book on mercy. It's in chapter 8. So one thing that the church, now in this case, this will be a lot of interaction with people who aren't necessarily part of the church, might not even believe in God. But we are here, and we believe that God loves us all and wants us all to have a more full, merciful life. So we can bring that mercy into our environment, even in encounters where that might not be at all religious. And so there are 3 basic ways of doing it. One is in creating, maintaining, and healing. There's a nice little essay by Bernard Monaghan, who's a very thoughtful theologian that some of us had occasion to encounter. And he has a little essay called Healing and Creating in Human History. And what he does with this is he says that ordinary people in every culture, in every age, people, by their own intelligence, their own insight, examining their own experience, coming to some wise judgments, can create a better world for themselves. And so every society, every culture that has taken shape, right from practically from the Stone Age on to today, has involved human ingenuity, human creativity. But there often are blind spots. Lonergan used to make a deal out of that, blind scotosis, the Latin word, blind spots that prevent us from seeing certain things, or failures, or selfishness gets in the way, what we call original sin. And so when that happens, then some people, usually people of God, of some more profound orientation, has to engage in healing. So the creating and the healing, in his essay, he doesn't talk about maintaining, but creating and healing are the 2 functions. Bubbling up from human creativity, and then asking God's mercy to do some healing. So that'll be the first theme. The second theme will be freedom and responsibility. And these always go together, freedom and responsibility. And they're kind of connected by human bonding. That's where we exercise mercy with one another. And then thirdly, we will look at how we can facilitate peacemaking by dialogue and reconciliation. Dialogue is a big word with the Pope. Dialogue and reconciliation. Okay, figure that out. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing for this evening. That make sense? All right. Now, since we're talking about the world, let me do a little thing to kind of set the stage, and that would be to kind of get an idea of what's going on in this world that we hope to help heal and dialogue with. And social psychologists, mainly, would talk about 5 fundamental pillars of society. And first of all, there's the family. Every society has families at the center of it, and it's a cluster of families, and the society is responsible to help families survive, proper ways for people to create homes, to raise their kids, and all that kind of thing. So family is essential. And then there's education. Because every society has to transmit the wisdom of the elders from their experience, transmit that to the next generation. So whether it's just sitting around the campfire and telling stories, or sending your kids off to college, we all have to be engaged in that somehow or other. Another one is religion. Now, some societies in the last 75 years have thought we could do without religion, but it's proving not to work very well, so that's kind of a failure of an experiment. Most societies realize that religion is an important part of human society. And then there's economy. Basically, how we exchange goods and services, because if every one of us had to do everything strictly on our own, it would be pretty difficult. I read a neat little book one time about a guy and his sweetheart who went off to Alaska, into a very remote part of Alaska, and they literally carved a place out of the wilderness there and built a log cabin. When you see a picture of it, it really looks like they just kind of laid a lot of trees on each other. They were married, they had a son, but she couldn't take it after about 10 years, and she left. And he's writing the book a little later. Well, it's pretty hard, and even there, he had to have somebody help him get a few dogs. They needed a couple of dogs when you're living out in Alaska. You have to have some friends to help you. So economy is how you do that exchange, where you're good at one thing, somebody else is good at something else, and even if it's strictly barter, it's still an economy. And then there's some kind of government. So those 5 things, and what happens is all 5 of these things relate. So the family engages in education and thrives because of education. The family needs to engage in economy. The family needs to depend on some larger structures. The family wants to pray and needs to know how to pray. Religion has something to say about education. Religion has something to say about what's fair in terms of justice and economy. Religion may have something to say about how people are governed. Religion doesn't control the government, but neither does the government control religion. They relate to each other. They don't control each other. Government and economy relate to each other. Economy relates to education. Government relates to education. So all of these things relate to one another. And now there have been, like I said, some societies that thought that they could do without the religions, but it doesn't seem to work. If you've ever heard the word a totalitarian government, totalitarian governments think that the government can control all of it. They're all in charge of everything. And that does not work. Each of these is independent as a unique function in society. It has its own way of doing things. So, for example, school boards are usually not the same as the city council. They might happen to be the same limits, but in Michigan, a lot of cities have 2 or 3 different school districts. It could be in one county or whatever. So education is supposed to be self-reliant. Government, it has its function. It needs to respect the family, listen to the values that religion has to offer, but it has its own job to do. So these things all relate to each other. They don't control one another. Well, here's the Pope right now, at this point, speaking to the church about the world that we live in. Now, there was a time in the Middle Ages, they call it the medieval synthesis, when it almost seemed to be a perfect balance. At least in hindsight, it looks that way. I don't know whether they felt that or not, but that the churches, the educational system, the government, the economy, the family, everything was just kind of humming along, just like a very well-oiled machine. And each part had its own part to play, but they really moved together pretty smoothly. That only happened, well, for a few hundred years. And whether or not it was a true synthesis, that's probably debatable, but at least they kind of speak of it that way. And sometimes we can kind of get nostalgic and wish that it were like that, where everything was just all that smooth and the church would always be respected, and when it spoke about the values, everybody would listen and that kind of thing. Well, that doesn't happen perfectly. But our task here is to try to figure out, are there some ways that we, as believing people, as a faithful community, that we can have some influence on these all the arenas of social life. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the goal of our discussion this evening. So creating, maintaining, and healing. The Pope takes a almost direct quote from the Second Vatican Council from Gaudium et Spes that humanity is experiencing a turning point in history. And he points out both the wonderful discoveries and communication methods and things like that that are just constantly, we're discovering new things. And it seems like the horizon is limitless. But at the same time, many people can barely survive. Disease seems to be spreading. People are gripped by fear and depression. So the Pope is conscious of this strange paradox that, on one hand, we seem to be much better able to do the things that we need in our world, and yet we're still living in a fair amount of problems that are just bubbling up. He makes an interesting comment. He says it's interesting that in the scriptures, the holy city is kind of like the image of the kingdom of God. And so you have this notion that a community with people coming together and everybody contributing really is kind of what God has in mind. And yet, if we look at our cities, we find that they're often crime and poverty and all these problems seem to be condensed often into cities. So what can we do about that? Every year at the Feast of Christ the King, when we pray the preface, we're praying for a kingdom of truth and life, a kingdom of holiness and grace, a kingdom of justice and love and peace. And that's our desire, that we can create this new Jerusalem, this holy city here on this earth. Well, that's of course what they call that utopia, right? It's never going to be a perfect city. But maybe we can make things somewhat better. The Pope uses an interesting phrase. He says, we are on a caravan of solidarity. So that we are kind of walking with one another on a pilgrimage, a caravan of solidarity, helping one another, comforting one another. So that's our challenge, to figure out a way that we can, because of our sense of God's presence and our hope in Jesus Christ and the resurrection, and our belief in the Holy Spirit pouring love into our hearts, that we can, in fact, have some effect in our environment. The Pope is very clear in paragraph 88 that we cannot afford to have a religion where it's very comfortable and cozy, a small circle of close friends. That just doesn't work. We're living in the world, we have to be responsive to the world. I don't know if I mentioned it here. Years ago, when we used 16mm films to teach kids, this is really going back into ancient history. And there was a neat little film produced by a Lutheran synod, and the image was a circus coming to town. Did I mention this? No. So it starts off, and you see these different wagons of different animals, and all painted different colors, and the circus is coming to town. And so while they're setting up, before the big top is set up, they're doing that in fact, and they're kind of helping each other carry water from the stream to water the elephants and this kind of thing. And so the circus people are really kind of caring for each other, looking after each other, getting everything ready for the circus the next day. Next day, here come all these kids, and they're all sitting in bleachers in the big tent. And there's kind of like a human puppet show. So there's human, actually, people who are on strings, and there's a guy who is working these strings as a puppet show. The problem is, this puppet show is very violent, and these puppets are thrashing at each other and hitting each other and kicking at each other, and at first the kids kind of think it's funny, but then it doesn't seem funny anymore, and the kids get very quiet, and they're just kind of almost getting scared, and the thing comes to a climax, and it just kind of, in fact, I think one of them actually falls to the ground. And that's how the movie ends. When we would show that to kids, they would at first, what's going on there? And then they would stop and think, why is it here these people cared about each other when they were getting the circus going together, and yet the show that they present is violent and almost a presentation of death. They thought they were being humorous, but it was actually quite vicious. Well, that was kind of congratulations to the Lutheran Church that thought of this, because that really is an image sometimes of how we can be very loving to each other within our own community, but actually become complicit in the evil and the violence and all the things that are wrong. So we really have a responsibility of bringing our perspective, our sense of hope, our sense of dynamism, our sense of care for one another. We have to bring that out into the environment, out where we live, where life is happening. That's kind of what we're about. There really are four. You ever heard of the 4 cardinal virtues? Old time, 4 cardinal virtues. 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. Right? They get us to God. Faith, hope, and charity get us to God. And in fact, that's in Romans 5, 1-5. If you read Romans 5, you'll see it right there. Faith, hope, and our faith in God the Father, who loves us, or made us, I think. Our hope in Jesus, which is not disappointed. Jesus does not disappoint us. And the Holy Spirit pouring out the love of God into our hearts. And so there you got faith, hope, and charity, and Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in about 4 or 5 verses. Well, the 4 cardinal virtues are more how we get along with each other. And the first cardinal virtue had to do with ourself as a person. Now, St. Augustine would use a word like fortitude, strength. But really, it's more about integrity. It's about wholeness. So each of us, as a person, needs to come to some sense of integrity. And because we're all image of God, we really need to work on that. And we grow into more and more of a sense of wholeness, of integrity. Secondly, since we can't live all by ourselves, we have friends and family that we live with. And so we pledge fidelity to one another. And we really live conscious of one another. So we use the word fidelity mainly between husband and wife, but fidelity happens with any intimate relationships. Siblings and families, parents and children, good friends, there's that sense of fidelity. Even, they use the word fiduciary, even if you go to a counselor and the counselor is working with you for several weeks or months, then that counselor develops a fiduciary relationship with you. They don't really become your friend, but they do, because of this intimate sharing, they do become responsible for you in one way or other. So whenever you have a fiduciary relationship, that's fidelity. So that's the second cardinal virtue. Now, Augustine was using an image from military life, so that would be like soldiers going to boot camp, and so the first thing you got to do is bulk up and develop your skills. The second thing is you got to be able to care for the unit, right? So you'll do anything to protect your fellow soldiers. Well, fiduciary, fidelity is a more full, humane way of saying it. The third is how we relate to society, and that's justice, the virtue of justice. So that's the common good, what they call the common good, that we are willing to work for the common good and contribute to the common good. What's the fourth cardinal virtue? Now that I've given you three, you should be able to guess at the fourth.
Mercy? Mercy?
Nope. Prudence. Prudence is the fourth cardinal virtue. And what prudence is, prudence helps you balance the first three. Because there are often times when I have to put aside my personal preferences right now for the sake of the family. We might have wanted to go out to see a movie tonight, but one of the kids gets sick. Well, then we've got to take care of the sick child, right? So you have to set aside your personal desires out of fidelity for one another. Sometimes we have to give for the common good so that all of us can benefit. So that's the virtue of prudence, helps us make those day-to-day decisions, minute-by-minute decisions of how do I balance the needs of myself, my family and friends, and my society. So that's basically what we're talking about here. All right, I think, there's a quote from the first, there's a lot of talk right now about the synod on the family that the Pope is calling. Pope Paul VI, as the Second Vatican Council was finishing, Paul VI had this idea, well, this was really a great experience. All these bishops of the world got together and they really felt the power of the Holy Spirit, and they really did come up with some great ideas and really resolved to make some changes in their churches. And so he decided, well, let's call a synod on a regular basis. Now, it's kind of not practical to get the entire episcopate together, all 3,000 of us, the bishops. So let's send delegates, and we'll have a synod, walking with, synod means to walk with. And every few years, we'll get together and talk about some important issues. And so they've been doing that ever since. The very first synod was on justice in the world. I think it was 1971. And there's where they made the statement, the working for justice is constitutive of the gospel. Not just thinking about justice or wishing for justice, but working for justice is part of the constitution of the gospel. It's constitutive of the gospel. Archbishop Dearden was the bishop then, and he participated in this. And when he came back, he assembled all the priests and was telling us about this. And it was kind of fun to listen to him just work out, what does it mean to be constitutive? So it's of the constitution of the gospel. So that's that work of justice is constitutive of the gospel. So that's essentially what we're up to. All right, so How can we do this? Well, freedom and responsibility, these always go together, and there's a pair there. Freedom has to do with my personal rights and my personal sense of my free will, what I can choose to do for purposes that I think are important. The responsibility is I am free, but I have to be responsible for the other people that I live with. So I can't do just anything I darn well please. I choose freely, but I choose responsibly. And then my choices will end up being more creative and more useful. What the Pope is saying is that if there's a bond of union, of love among us, then that will help that freedom and responsibility to really go together. And if there isn't this bond of care for one another, then it's going to be difficult to really be as responsible as we should be. So that, develop these bonds. That's why last week we talked about contemplate the closeness of the compassionate Christ. And realize that the compassionate Christ is in every one of us. Each one of us represents the compassionate Christ, and we are compassionate. We are both exercising that compassion and receiving that compassion. So if we really are contemplating one another as in the closeness of the compassionate Christ, then that's the bonding. So that's what the Pope is hoping for, is that we will really try to affect some personal bond with one another. And then we will be responsible for one another. When he first became Pope, I don't know how often he said this, but I heard him do it more than once. He would say he was just Pope a couple of months, and he had a big group of people there on Pentecost. The whole St. Peter's Square was full of people. And so he says, people sometimes will come to confession and they will, and I'll say, do you give alms to the poor? And the person will say, oh, yes, Father. And when you give alms to the poor, do you look them in the eye and you take them by the hand and ask them, what can I do for you? Oh, I never thought about that, Father. So that's what he's trying to get us to do, that even when we're giving alms to the poor, it isn't just a drop of a coin in a kettle, as they said in the first reading that we had. It's take a person by the hand, look them in the eye. What can I do for you? That's that bonding. And when there's that sense of communion, then you're able to really invite the person into your community and then help them really become a part of your community. I just yesterday was at a luncheon with some pastors in the city with the manager of the new Meijer store that's opening up in Detroit, on the west side of Detroit. And so they wanted to meet with the pastors of the locality and let us know that they were interested in contributing to the community. And so they wanted us to be sure that we would get our membership, our parishioners, to apply for jobs there. There'll be nearly 300 jobs at that store. And so, well, of course, we immediately asked two questions. I forget how the pastor said it. He didn't use the word, what if they have a record, criminal record. He said it in a different way, but they knew exactly what he was saying. And they said, well, don't worry about that. What we'll do is, granted, they will be screened, or we'll have a third party screening them, and they will in fact get a notice that they found a criminal record that you have. But we're not going to ask the question in the first place, so they won't be embarrassed in the interview, and they won't have to lie. So that we're not going to ask the question, and we're going to note that, and we'll see, all right, this person has a record. What was it for? Is it for grand larceny last year? They may not hire that person. But is it something, somebody was in a fight 10 or 15 years ago, and by accident they injured a person and they got convicted of serious assault? Well, maybe they've matured since then. We'll look at their whole presentation of what they can do. Do they have the skill sets that we need for this job? And we'll look at that record, but we won't hold it against them. Well, I was glad to hear that. Some of the people that you've been hearing these last few weeks telling you about that, these are the kind of things that people run into. And the other one, of course, we asked right away, do they have to have a high school education? And again, they said, well, we're gonna ask that. We kind of hope that people have at least a high school education, but we're not demanding it. And if they can do the job, we'll take that into consideration. And then I was able to pipe up and say, well, as a matter of fact, if it would be advantageous for them, we have a GED program right on our campus at Christ the King. So if somebody wants to get an advancement at work where they have to have a high school equivalency, they can stop over at our place just 2 blocks away from the Myers store, and they can get their GED. So that's what it means to really take the person by the hand, look them in the eye. What can I do for you? It's that sense of compassion and realize that if a person's trying to get a job but they have a criminal record, they're going to always bump into that. So what can we do for you? How can we handle that? I was pleased to hear them say they're doing this. By the way, apparently Mr. Meyer, who started Myers, which is, I don't know, all over the world now, I suppose, he's dead now, but he was very explicit about this, that he wants to try to help his employees. So that was, it was kind of we had a great lunch, and it was a good way to kind of get to know the people who are running that store, and I hope that it will be an advantage in our neighborhood. Okay. Oh, paragraph 54 is kind of the famous paragraph that the Pope, they picked up on this pretty quickly. Some people defend trickle-down theories, assuming that free markets inevitably bring about inclusive justice. This opinion, however, has never been confirmed by the facts. It's a naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and the sacred workings of the economic system. So the economy is not necessarily, doesn't have a mind that's very compassionate necessarily. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. Sustaining a selfish lifestyle develops indifference. We cannot dismiss the cry of the poor as someone else's problem. We're thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase, but we're unmoved by the lives that are stunted by lack of opportunity. So that's his critique of the economic system that is pretty much profit-driven and doesn't really have a sense of how are we managing this? The rich just keep getting richer, the poor getting poorer. What's going on there? He talks about the importance of a non-ideological ethics. This is in chapter 57. A non-ideological ethic. Ideology means you have a clever idea, and this idea kind of becomes sacred to you, and it's all you can think about. Anything that ends in ism is usually an ideology. So communism, community is wonderful. Communism is where the whole government tries to manage the whole thing, right? Individualism, individual sacredness is very important, but to make the individual be sacred, that nobody can tell me what to do, then that's an ideology. So he's calling for an ethic that is conscious of the interrelationships of people. So self, intimate and social society, and that our ethics should be brought together that way. Our free will and our responsibility governed by the bond among us. There's the classic statement in paragraph 208. If anyone, he's been kind of hard on people who are only thinking about themselves. If anyone feels offended by my words, I respond that I speak with affection and the best of intentions, quite apart from any personal interest or political ideology. My words are not those of a foe or opponent. I am interested only in helping those who are in thrall of an individualistic, indifferent, and self-centered mentality, to be freed from those unworthy chains, and to attain a more humane way of living and thinking, noble and fruitful, which will bring dignity to their presence on this earth. So he's hoping to kind of shake us out of our complacency and give us a more noble way to live while in our presence on this earth. Okay, well, let's go to the third section on peacemaking, dialogue, and reconciliation. He quotes the Aparecida document. That's a city in Latin America. Aparecida. And they just had a synod there of the bishops of Latin America about 3 or 4 years ago. It was while he was still Archbishop in Argentina. And the bishops, I think, of all of Latin America got together at this city called Aparecida. And that 2007 was when it was, so that's when it was. And they had this meeting, and the first meeting they had like this was at Pueblo in Mexico, and this was some years later. And so they really hammered out continuing to see how can the church help facilitate social justice in our environment. So you'll notice he quotes from that every once in a while. He was one of the drafters of the document, so he knew it very well. Paragraph 271. Jesus does not want us to be grandees who look down upon others, but men and women of the people. This is not an idea of one pope or one pastoral opinion among others. These are injunctions of the Word of God that are so clear, direct, and convincing that they need no interpretation. Let us live them without commentaries. Then we'll know the joy of sharing life with God's people, and as we strive to light a fire in the heart of the world. So this is certainly the heart of Pope Francis. He makes 4 points. These are 4 principles that he has come to through, I think, a lot of prayer over his own life and his own ministry. And so time is more important than space. Now, he doesn't mean that time, that space is not important, but what he's saying is space is important. Where you live, your piece of property, your house, your church, whatever it is important, but it's only important because of what you're doing there. And what you're doing there is an ongoing relationship. That's the time part of it. So what you're doing in and with your space, your possessions, is really the basic principle. So we always have to think about that. So just amassing more and more possessions is not really what's most important. What are you doing with those possessions is really the question. So we all have to be responsible with our savings, for example, for retirement and that kind of thing. But the point is, how are you going to use that? And are you able to balance that out with your responsibility for other people? So time is greater than space. And of course, many of the wars over the centuries have been fought over space, right? And that's unfortunate, you know, that taking possession of territory is often the guiding light instead of what are we doing with one another. The second one, unity prevails over conflict. And he's very candid about the fact that there is conflict in the world. There's conflict in our relationships. And so we can't ignore that. We don't want to just bury the conflict under the rug. We have to face it. We have to talk about it. We have to actually engage one another, even when we're in conflict. And because coming to a sense of unity really will, that's where the truth is going to be. Frequently in conflict, you've got different opinions or different ideas, and the truth is buried down beneath that, and it usually encompasses both of those, or all three, and so the conflict is really surface, and we end up expending all our energy battling the conflict instead of coming to the underlying unity. So that's an important principle of keeping in mind. The third thing, realities are important, more important than ideas. In other words, the reality is bigger than any one of our ideas about that thing. So we all have some catch, some handle on what is real, but my approach to it is going to be from this perspective, and your approach is going to be from your perspective, and you may see something at this reality that I can't see, and yet it's all part of the reality. So we have to exchange with one another and find out, well, what are you seeing there? What's going on there? And so coming up with each other's ideas, all these different ideas will help us come to the reality. Now, Pope Benedict said this very clearly when he was talking shortly before, about 6 months before he resigned. He was in Lebanon. And he was meeting with the other religious leaders there. He gave a speech in Beirut. And what he said was, no one can say, I possess the truth. Truth only exists in God. If you say, I possess the truth, you have made the truth an idol of your own creation. We all have to listen to one another and come to the truth together. Now of course, the context was specifically talking with other religious leaders, some of them not Catholic, some Orthodox, Armenian, whatnot. But that was a very important insight. Now here's a guy who's been working on expressing the truth his entire career. Since he was a young priest, as an advisor of the Second Vatican Council, he's been hammering out the truth day after day, year after year. And his recent job before he became Pope was the office of doctrine, right? Letting people know what is the truth. But no one can say, I possess the truth. All of us have a take on the truth, but none of us has the entire truth. That would be idolatry. We make a god out of our conception of the truth. So Francis is saying the same thing here. Maybe that's where he got it from. So that's where the ideology has a problem. People who have it are really clinging on to one idea about what it means to be a true Catholic, what it means to be, a true citizen, all these kind of things. And it tends to be our own idea about it. It doesn't tend to be broad enough to let other people amplify, modify, complement what we know about what's real. So what's real is bigger than all of us. Reality exists in God, and the truth is what God knows. The rest of us only know a part of it. And some of us may have a better glimpse than others, and that's why we want to dialogue with each other, to help us all understand something else about the truth. And the whole is greater than the part, or parts. That's a kind of the basic principle, by the way, in any kind of social psychology. They say that the whole is the greater than the parts. In other words, whenever you got a group of people together and you get us to kind of work together, each of us has some energy that we can contribute to it, some knowledge about the problem, some solution that might work, and we end up creating sort of an energy with one another that the whole that we come up with is greater than the addition of each one of our parts that we can contribute. So the Pope is saying the same thing, and that all of us have to realize that we're engaged in a bunch of parts of the truth and of reality and of the gospel, and the whole is greater than all the parts even added together. He uses an interesting image. He studied some geometry when he was a student, and so he says this is even more than a sphere, because a sphere kind of pretends it's perfect because every point is equidistant from the center, but reality is not as neat as that. It's a polyhedron that are, almost a countless number of facets. So you think of a cut diamond that has several facets, many facets, and catch the light in all different ways. And so that's what reality is, sort of like a diamond that's glinting in the sun in every different way. So that's a kind of a common little way of putting that. And then finally, he calls us to entertain dialogue with every political organization, engage in the political process, engage with people of different religions, because we're all living in this planet together, so that we can actually contribute with one another, find out what the other religions are thinking, non-Christian religions, whatever, so that we can all kind of bring our particular aspect to the whole community. So this is his suggestion that we really engage in the world around us. Sometimes we'll find kindred spirits who may even be of the same religion that we are, maybe the same parish. But for the most part, we'll be bumping shoulders with people who have different religions, different ideas about things, but we're all in this together. It's one big community, so that's the responsibility that we have. So that's just a little sampling of some of his ideas about how the heart of, we can bring the heart of God into the heart of the world and transform the entire human family. All right? Rod, you want to take just a couple of minutes and see if you can think of some example, some experience that you've had where it has worked, where you have in fact been able to contribute something of corporal work of mercy or something of the mercy of God in a situation. Let's just stop and think for a minute. See if you can think of it, a time, an occasion, an encounter when you were able to do this. Okay, let's just kind of talk at your tables for a couple minutes. So share that.